Okay, before I introduce our speaker, just a little bit of history I'd like to share with you about punchki. And punchki is plural. You don't add an S. It's already plural. I didn't know that. Punchkis are a specialty pastry reserved for once a year in honor of Fat Tuesday. It is a Catholic day of celebration, and it is the precursor to the Lenten season, and the last day to indulge in foods before the traditional 40-day period of Lent. People of Poland used up food so it did not be spoiled or wasted. Families would use up their eggs, butter, and sugar and fruit by treating themselves to one last time before Lent began with these rich donuts. Tradition was started in the medieval age during the reign of August III. That's a bit of history I have no idea. I was wondering, but they're good, aren't they? So anyways, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. David Cole. Dr. David Cole received his BSME in mathematics, MSME, and PhD from the University of Michigan, and an honorary doctorate from Cleary University. Dr. Cole is the chairman emeritus of the Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor, Michigan, chairman of Auto Harvest and Building America's Tomorrow. He was formerly director of the Office for the Study of Automotive Transportation at the University of Michigan, Transportation Research Institute, and an engineering professor at the University of Michigan. He has worked extensively on internal combustion engines, vehicle design, and overall automotive trends. And if you want to know more about Dr. David Cole, you can go to our website. There's much more about him that you can learn. Such a fabulous person. So I'd like to introduce Dr. David Cole.
Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and especially when you run into one of your old students, Chris Theodore, who, what surprises me is that his hair is not fully gray yet. And it's kind of nice and comforting to look around the room here and see a lot of, well, let me put it this way, blonde hair. My wife was a brunette, and she gradually stopped having her hair dyed, and she turned into a silver blonde. So blonde is better than gray, and I hope you understand that. It's also great, when I say, to see one of the old students like Chris, and the thing I'm amazed with, Chris, is that your hair is not fully gray, because he goes back, he must be, what are you, 45 now? 50, 55, 65? And let me tell you, when he was a young guy, he was a car guy, and today he is still a car guy. He's deeply involved in all things related to this industry. And it's really an amazing industry in so many ways. There's just so much going on today that we didn't see 40 and 50 years ago. It's been hugely politicized. It's totally global right now. And when I think of some of the things that I saw in the past, it's very different. For example, I grew up in a car family. My dad was at General Motors. In fact, one of the things I remember, he was chief engineer of Chevrolet in '53. And I didn't really understand it at the time, but they brought the '55 Chevy to market in 23 months from the start of the program to cars and dealerships. And one of the interesting parts of that was the small block engine, which has been the highest volume engine ever produced. It's still the basic design, the materials are different, and so on. But it was always fascinating to kind of watch what was going on in this industry, and that's one of the reasons that when I went to the University of Michigan, that I said, I'm really pretty interested in the car business. Actually, when I was a kid, I spent every summer from 5 until my teens at my grandparents' farm in western Michigan. And I always wanted to go to Michigan State and study agriculture. And one day my dad sat down with me and he said, there's a big difference between a vacation farmer and a real farmer. For example, I don't know how many of you are familiar with farms, but my grandparents' farm was both fruit and dairy. And if you have dairy cattle, 365 days a year, every morning and every afternoon, you milk cows. And for somebody that liked to sleep in the morning, and that's why engineering became a much more attractive field. Another thing that was interesting is watching things happen. Back in the 80s, we had a project that was called the U.S.-Japan Auto Project that was sponsored by Shoichiro Toyoda at Toyota. And we were back and forth to Japan a bunch of times. I was the U.S. director of the project, and all of the CEOs, Chrysler, GM, and Ford, were involved in the project. And I'll never forget, we did a project, or had been doing a project, somebody may be aware of, it's called a Delphi Forecast, where you ask people their vision of 5 and 10 years into the future in technology and markets. And at that time, we had people across the industry, some of you may have participated in that. We asked their view of the future. And you always got a curve that looked like this. It was spread. Sometimes, this was before the internet, we'd go through 3 rounds to try to condense things. At the same time, same questions in Japan, basically across the industry, manufacturers and suppliers, they all gave the same answers to everything. And I'll never forget Shoichiro Toyoda. We made a presentation of this, and he absolutely went berserk when he saw this data. And he looked at it, and his son Akio speaks very good English, but Shoichiro didn't speak English, but through a translator, he said, "We all think alike." And one of the things that came from that, I don't know if you're aware of it, but the 2 tech centers of Toyota in Ann Arbor were a result of that effort, because he said we have to get away from ourselves. And that was always fascinating to see. Another interesting story involved Ford. Do any of you remember the name Jack Nasser? Jack was a fairly short guy. He was about 5'2", and when he went to Ford, he would go into a group, and the group would overperform, and upper management said, "We've got to move Jack up." And what happened, when he left the group would fall apart. And he was sort of a dictator, king type of a leader, and it was not sustainable, but they didn't understand that at the time until he became CEO. And one of the pieces of good news about Jack Nasser as CEO is that Ford was at the edge of bankruptcy a couple of years ahead of the problems that we ran into in the 08-09 period. And remember, they even had to mortgage the Blue Oval. And of course, I was sitting at my desk one day because Bill Ford fired Jack, came in to lead the company, and I got a call from Bill, and he said, "You know, I've worked at Ford all my life. I don't know anything about manufacturing, engineering, or markets, sales." He had cushy jobs because he was a family member of the Ford family. And he says, "I don't know how to run this company, and I'm going to bring in somebody from outside." And he tried to find somebody from the auto industry that would come to Ford, and nobody would take the job. He finally went to Boeing and brought in a guy, Alan Mulally, who became the CEO at Ford. And when I talked to Jack, Bill, it was about 30 days before the announcement. And a couple of days later, I talked to Alan on the phone, and we talked for about a half an hour, and he never said I, me. It was always we, us, and the team. And that was the difference in leadership style that you saw between what I view as a coach leader and a king leader. And there's no question that a coach leader is the appropriate kind of leadership that we see in this business. Well, I'm going to talk today about the auto future, fast, furious, and uncertain. And what you have to understand is that this is a crazy industry, and I recognize that while you're still associated with the industry, it's a different world than it was a few years ago. And one of the aspects of this is the old business model, how we ran things. And that model is really broken. It's gone. You think of the old business model was lean, physical prototypes, king leaders, job for life, regional, structural. It was slow, it was bureaucratic. It was not appropriate for the industry that we require today. And so what we have seen is a migration from that old model to what I would call the new business model. Virtual prototypes, more coaches rather than kings, E-enabled, lean agile. And these are all critical issues in the industry today that if you're good at these, you're much more capable than in the past. For example, co-opetition. That would have been something unheard of. But co-opetition today is a big deal across the world where you have companies that compete and cooperate at the same time. And that's the reality.
You're fine.
Oh, okay.
Just put the mic right in here. Just make life easier for yourself.
Make life easier,
Let's see
okay.
if we can do that.
The older I get, the more important it is to make life easier. But in any event, what we have seen is this huge transition in the business model of the industry. And those of you that have been around this industry for a long time, you understand what has happened and what is happening today. And it's truly a very special and important story. Another point that I would make is that the industry is very unstable and it's not in its final form. Now, most people that were a part of any business like stability, like things that were predictable. But that's not the industry that we're in right now, and my guess is that that's going to continue to be that way for a long, long time. Another interesting issue is the kind of political impact that we have seen from the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and it has really impacted the industry in a lot of different ways. Some very directly because of the size and complexity of the industry. We still hear a lot of interface in the political world, but trade, the whole issue of regulations, a really big deal when you look at the regulatory environment and how that is shifting today. The politics, obviously this is a huge thing, and basic economics, taxes, the tax structure, international relations, because what we're really into today is an industry that is a truly global industry rather than the historic industry that was more regional. And one of the things I would say for sure is surprises are likely. So if you're in the business today or a shareholder in the business today, the surprises, that is unpredictable things that can happen, are likely to happen. Another, I think, fascinating part of the industry today is that it's being kind of divided into the haves and have-nots. Some of the companies that seem to have everything together, they're in pretty good shape. There are have-nots, and this has been particularly true in the supply base. And when you think about the industry, we often think in terms of the OEMs, the cars that are made by the manufacturers. And give you an example, at one point, less than 10% of the IP in the industry came out of the supply base. Today, it's over 50%. And it's just the reality of the industry. Unpredictable, it's on a good course, but it's going to be challenging for as far as we can see into the future. And when you look at what success requires, obviously cost and revenue are a big deal. You have to have reasonable cost in your products. You've got to have good revenue in the products. But there are two other factors that are extremely important. One is the agility, the ability to move and change as the circumstances change. As engineers and as a kid growing up in an engineering house, the idea was you want to keep on this path. That path now is not very predictable. And the whole issue of innovation, the ability to bring new ideas, new products, new technology into the game. And when you look at the world today with the potential of electrification, you look at autonomous technology, you look at robotics, and all of the other factors that are involved in the industry, it puts a tremendous emphasis on the ability to be innovative, to be a part of the industry of tomorrow. Another issue is what I would call the world of vanishing boundaries. You know, historically, this company was here, this company was there, the supplier was here, a supplier is there. But what we're seeing is the boundaries between different aspects of the industry are disappearing. And that's one of the realities in the world today in the new business model compared to the old one, where we had a very predictable structure. That's gone. And that's, of course, a tremendous challenge to the leaders in the industry to deal with this kind of an issue. What engineers like is predictability. What we have in this business today is unpredictability. There are mega issues. And of course, you're all familiar with them. I mean, things like technology, we're looking at electrification, you're looking at autonomous technology, materials issues, what are we going to have? Advanced materials, aluminum, steel, whatever. The issue of people, politics, mobility. What do we really mean by that? Moving people from one place to another? Are we going to have our hands on the wheel? Or is the car going to drive while we're asleep in the back seat? And of course, the climate issues are very significant today. In fact, one of the most political dimensions that I've seen is the whole issue of climate. And I'll tell you a quick story. I was mentioning it to our folks at lunch. I had a friend by the name of Frank Jamerson. And Frank was the father of the first EV, electric vehicle at GM. And you would have thought that Frank was going to be really pushing electric vehicles his whole life. He wrote a paper predicting vehicle technology of the future, and he did not see moving from internal combustion engines for a long time, but ultimately that was going to happen. And he had an interesting graph that he showed in his paper, and it showed the forecast by scientists of the future global temperature, and from 20 to 30 years ago, compared to what we have seen in the actual temperature. And there was only one of the models that was correct. It happened to be a Russian model that did not include carbon. And so the whole issue now of climate change and the factors that are involved in that is a very important and interesting issue. And the unfortunate thing is that it's become overly politicized. And that, to me, is a big deal. Another issue, obviously, are international events. They continue. We have the Russians in their warfare. We've got other kinds of things going on all over the world. We're uncertain about what China is going to do with Taiwan. What role should we play? But all of these things are impactful on this industry and have to be considered very seriously. And of course, natural events. What has happened over in Turkey and with the earthquakes? What was it? 30-some thousand people were killed. I've traveled all over the world and I've been to places like this. And what you understand is that when these events occur, they change things rather dramatically. And then, of course, we look at autonomous technology and autonomous vehicles. The idea that I'll be sleeping in the back seat on our trip up north. That's going to be quite a while. We'll talk about that a little bit later. In terms of the future market, one of the things that we conclude is that disruptions are likely. That is, if you're not prepared to change by being surprised, we're going to have a problem in this business. Interest rates, what are they going to be? We've seen them go up, they've come down. The politics, the economy, the issue of energy, where are we going to get our energy from? What is it going to be? The components, the materials. As we look across the spectrum of the industry, what we see is a huge amount of uncertainty. Now, if you're an engineer, that's a good deal. You get a chance to do things. If you're a finance guy, it's very unsettling because you like to have predictability as far as you can see into the future. But that's not true today. We're not going to see that. Now there are a bunch of choke points, things that I feel that are very critical in this business. For example, talent. I don't know if you're aware of it, but right now there's a shortage of a couple of million people with an appropriate education in manufacturing. And it's not unique here, it's true all over the world. The politics of things. What are the next administration going to do? What's the impact of local politics, state politics, national politics, international politics? All of these are critical factors in this business. Tooling. As we move more and more to autonomous technology, tooling is becoming a really big deal, and one of the areas that is particularly short of talent right now is the tooling industry. Equipment, natural events, materials. What are the future materials going to be, and where are we going to get them from? I'll talk a little bit later about this with respect to electric vehicles, because what we find is that when we talk about some of the possible future pathways, the materials issues become extreme, very important. Manufacturing talent. Boomers are retiring. I assume that, like me, many of you are older than a boomer. And in fact, when we look at the retirements that have occurred, the senior people have retired at a higher rate after we got into the whole problem with the disease. What are we going to do? All jobs require today special skills. Now, when you think about the old days, you could have somebody with a high school dropout walk into a manufacturing plant and things would be fine. The foreman would just tell them, just follow my instructions. That time is gone. When we think of the whole K through 12 pipeline, it's just not adequate for the kind of talent that is required in the world that we live in today with this industry. Manufacturing, some people think that's the assembly line, but it's from the earliest concepts ultimately to the sales of the product. So it's a spectrum of forces that are at play in this issue. And I mentioned the talent issue, and when we look at the numbers, it's going to be over 2 million. In fact, some of the more recent data suggests that we could be pushing a 3 million talent shortage in the U.S. in manufacturing, not just auto, but everywhere. But it's a big deal. And of course, I think you all recognize that manufacturing always has been high-tech, but it's really high-tech now. Another business issue that is extremely challenging for the industry are the CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy standards. And as we've seen now, particularly with the new administration, this is highly uncertain. There historically has been a review period to kind of assess what the capabilities are. What about tax credits? What about energy issues, politics, cost value? The fact is that when we look at the CAFE requirements and the auto industry, we're dealing with an extraordinarily uncertain issue as we look forward into the future. And where they're going to go, anybody knows right now. Now, one of the interesting things to look at is the issue of annual fuel cost related to MPG. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's 3 different levels of fuel price, $1.50 a gallon, $3 a gallon, and $5 a gallon. We've sort of been all over that over the past few years. But if you're getting a truck that gets 10 or 15, 12 miles per gallon, it's a big deal. As you push the fuel economy out to higher levels, the differences between the value of fuel price changes dramatically. And when you get out to the area of 30 and 40 miles per gallon, the impact of fuel price on the average consumer is much less than when they were driving cars that got 10 miles per gallon. Another big issue is materials competition. And one of the points that I make here is that it's a systems issue. That is, you can't look at just the individual material, you have to look at it in the context of the system of the vehicle. whether you're dealing with body parts, structure, engine components, it doesn't make any difference. It's highly not static, which means that it's a part of the industry that is going through continuous change, and it's not going to stop, in my view. Another issue is the current production system. And when you think of how we produce vehicles today, in many ways it was similar to what we did in the past, but as we look at automation and how that's beginning to apply and how we design, it's a different world. And ultimately, what's going to determine this whole trend gets down to the basic economics. If the economics don't make sense, you've got a big problem. Another issue is the value of weight savings. And one of the greatest examples of this is sort of the Ford versus everybody else in the industry. And I put this down as GM, because Ford, what did they do a few years back in the F-Series trucks? They went to aluminum. Now, one of the fascinating things about aluminum is different. It's harder to put them together. And one of the problems that Ford has, what we normally use with steel, is resistance welding. You touch them, you flow a current through, and it connects the materials. When Ford went to aluminum, they had a problem. I would also mention that Ford and GM have combined design and development of transmissions. And they've done this for a number of years, back 5-speed, now 9 and 10-speed transmissions. But GM owned the patents on resistance welding of aluminum, so Ford could not use resistance welding. And so what did they go to? Glue and rivets. Ultimately, if you look at the F-Series truck and a comparable Ford or Dodge truck, the Ford truck is about $2,500 more expensive to make with aluminum and the technology in it. And one of the things that is very true is that the low-cost guy sets the price in the marketplace. The high-cost guy has to make that price. Now, as I look forward to the potential of electric vehicles, this is a really big deal. And I don't know if you're aware of it, you probably occasionally look at the stock market, but it wasn't too many years ago that Ford and GM stock was roughly the same. Now GM is about 3 times as expensive as the Ford stock. And what that tells you is factors related to cost in a company and that cost competitiveness are hugely important. And think about this as we move forward into the future with the potential for EVs and autonomous technology and the like. And of course, one of the points here is nothing is for sure forever. We're in an extraordinarily dynamic period, and that's going to be the world that we live in for a long, long time. And in fact, as an 80-plus-year-old guy, it's a lot more predictable in my life ahead than it's going to be for our kids and grandkids. In fact, it was interesting. We just had our first great-grandchild. And I thought, our oldest granddaughter was an interesting person. She was a 6'5" girl. She was a 3-time All-American volleyball player at Michigan. She married a basketball player who was 6'7". And when the baby was born, he was 11 pounds. And the doctors told him he's going to be about 6'11". And both of their coaches had told them that when you have babies, we'll call them recruits. In fact, our oldest, Abby's husband, was a basketball player at Michigan, but he had an interesting career because he only scored 1 point in his career. His father was a pilot. Austin Hatch is his name. His father was in a plane crash when Austin was a kid, and he lost his brother, sister, and mom. And then 9 days after he signed to play basketball at Michigan, he was in another plane crash with his dad. And he lost his dad and stepmom, and he was in the hospital for 2 months in a coma. And ultimately, he recovered from that, but he wasn't the basketball player was before the plane crash. In fact, his primary job is going across the country telling his story. And his story is basically, it's not about today or the past, it's about the future. And that's what's really important in terms of your preparations. Future power plants. Gasoline engines, diesels, hybrids, fuel cells, electric, hydrogen. Who knows? But the reality is, the answer is ultimately going to depend on the economics to the average person. That's going to be the critical factor. Future fuels. You know, we think of petroleum, biofuels, hydrogen, NH3, nitrogen. We don't know what those fuels are really going to be, but ultimately, the answer is going to depend on two factors: economics and politics. And that's an issue today that's extremely important as we look forward in this business. What's the future price of gasoline going to be? The last year or so, we've seen $1.50, we've seen $5. We don't know. And remember the curve that I showed you later. As we improve fuel economy, the difference that price makes in terms of the cost to the average person is going to get smaller and smaller. When we think about the breakthrough areas, that is things that are potential game changers in this business, obviously one is advanced batteries. Advanced fuels. We were talking at lunch today about hydrogen as a fuel. We don't know. What about autonomous vehicle, autonomous technology? One of the things that we know for sure, it's the lawyers are waiting in line to have fully autonomous vehicles because then they can sue the company rather than the person. And advanced material systems. The dynamics of the world that we live in this industry are actually unbelievable. Electrification. We're all talking about it. It's being pushed politically big time. What are advanced batteries going to be? We talk about lithium. We talk about lithium is in all major batteries today for vehicles. We talk about solid state batteries. Are they going to be affordable? Can we make them? Huge questions. What's the capacity of the grid? Just to give you an example of that, if you take a typical grid of 25 homes and you put 2 or 3 or 4 electric vehicles, you've exhausted the capacity of that grid. So when we talk about electrification, it's not just the vehicle, it's the whole electrical system that we're dealing with. It's economics and politics. And of course, we are well aware of the political issues that we see today with the current administration pushing the daylights out of electrification. And ultimately, in my view, when you talk to the average person about electric vehicles, they don't think about it. In fact, over 95% of the people that drive EVs have other vehicles in their family. And so the idea that this is going to be my vehicle of tomorrow is not something that the average person thinks about. And where the impact becomes real is with the customer. That is, when a customer begins to look at the economic impact of this shift in powertrains and vehicles, you're going to see a political factor that is extremely important in future elections. And my guess is that it will be an important factor in the next election. And advanced material systems. You know, what do we need to take the weight out of these vehicles? And I think most of you have probably looked at electric vehicles, probably driven some. I've driven a couple of them. They're fun to drive. I wouldn't mind having an electric vehicle if they could do everything my IC engine vehicle could do. But they're not even close to that point as yet. Battery technology, huge, huge issue. And you're reading about it all the time. I don't know how many of you read tech materials or you read the Wall Street Journal. One of the things that we realize is that this issue is way up in the air. We see the formation of new companies all over the world, new technologies being developed. One of the things you hear about is that the real savior is a solid-state battery technology. It's being demonstrated, but the economics are absolutely horrible. Where is this going to go? The fact is, we don't know. It's on a path where it's getting tremendous investment, but the pathway into the future is extremely uncertain. And one thing it tells me is if you're in the auto business, you better be able to play whatever game emerges, which means that you got to be great at IC engines, you got to be the best at electrification, and if you're not, you've got a real problem. In fact, right now, the typical electric vehicle has a cost of about $150 a kilowatt hour. That's the battery cost. The break-even point for an EV between a gasoline engine vehicle is $100 a kilowatt hour. That is, if you can't get to that point, you're in huge difficulty. Now, if you do, whoever has the least expensive battery that matches performance-wise with other batteries is going to be the prime time player. And if they're not, you got a problem. So the whole business of electrification is very uncertain, overly politicized, and something that you want to watch very carefully. Autonomous technology. I think we all kind of dream that it would be nice to sleep in the back seat on a trip, but not here. And I can also tell you, and I may have mentioned this earlier, the trial lawyers are eagerly awaiting the emergence of autonomous technology. Tesla has been pushing this for some time. In fact, it's an interesting, complex legal and political issue that they're facing right now. And one of the problems occurred in Florida where somebody was on autopilot, a 18-wheeler pulled in front of him. The autopilot didn't see it. He drove under the 18-wheeler and cut his head off. And these are actually quite numerous in Teslas where people beginning to be overly reliant on their autopilot technology. What's going to be the cost? What about the technology? Who are the winners? What about the liability issues? What about policy? Huge issue in the industry. And my prediction is that it's going to be a long time before we see a fully autonomous vehicle. Level 0 is no autonomy. 5 is you're asleep in the back seat and go anywhere. 4 is you can be in a restricted area. 3 is you got to keep your eyes on the road. We're just now beginning to approach the third level in the industry. So we're a long, long ways from level 4 and level 5. Knowledge is the competitive edge. In fact, I've never seen a period in this industry where basic knowledge is more important than it is today. Extremely important. And it's so varied. Some people say, well, you're talking about electrical. No, I'm talking about all kinds of technology, everything. It's all a factor. And if you're not at the leading edge of technology, you're going to have a real problem in this business as we look forward. Also, we have to look at innovation and how important it is. Innovative people and companies are going to win in this business. Another thing that's important is that it takes a team. It's not an individual or just a company. It requires an appropriate agglomeration of people from multiple areas, probably globally. Leadership is actually critical. And leadership means that you're part of a team that has the factors in play to ultimately win the game. Another issue that is a challenge is that we have to look across traditional boundaries. As engineers, one of the things that I grew up with is that everything was kind of defined. And this is the box that I'm in with these definitions. That's going away. And the ability to cross boundaries fluidly is very, very important. In fact, there's another statement that I first heard many years ago from Bob Lutz. Sometimes it's better to ask forgiveness than questions. And some of you may remember that. he basically said that you can't be constrained by the rules of the game all the time. And in conclusion, fasten your seatbelts, because the next few years are going to be really interesting and really challenging, and that's just great part of being a part of this wonderful industry. Thanks very much for allowing me to be here today. I appreciate the time.
Today, my knowledge, a lot part of our cost of gas is state tax, right?
Yes, taxes are a big deal. EVs, without those
An
taxes.
electric vehicle, I'll never pull on to a gas station. Are EVs going to get a free ride as far as road maintenance and all the other costs that are supported by gas?
Well, the question is, with EVs, you don't pay a fuel tax. And the fact is that we're going to have to find some way that EVs can contribute to keeping up our roads. As most of you live here or drive around in the state of Michigan, our roads need a lot of work. A number of years ago, my wife actually went to Michigan State, which is a college to the west here. And it was when they were building I-96. And they hadn't built it all the way yet, but what I found I could do is drive on stretches of I-96, which were a lot faster than driving on Grand River through the towns. And those roads were in great shape. But that was over 50 years ago. And so what we're facing today is a tremendous amount of effort to bring our highways and roads up to speed. And electric vehicles are going to have to be a part of paying for that. That's a good question. We don't know. But there is going to be some form of tax to cover that. Yes. Yeah.
Citizens use a watch with rechargeable batteries, so I never need to put a battery in my watch. Is that something possible with the cars?
That you can change the battery? Yes, there are a couple of technology or companies that have been working on, when you pull into the shop, they drop the old battery or the down battery out, put in a new one that's fully charged. I don't think that's going to be that popular if we go to EVs. It's going to be more related to relatively high charging speeds. And right now that's a real problem. When you look at trips, and I know people that have EVs, it's a real challenge on those trips because you have to know where a place is that you can get a charge. And one of the things that they're finding is that a significant fraction of them are not functional. And so this is a huge problem. Stay tuned. Yes. Yeah, the question is, we don't have adequate charging capability, and who's going to push that? And the feds are putting money into that now. They're putting our tax dollars into charging stations. But the whole issue of charging, the time it takes, where the stations are located, is a huge issue, and that's part of the political environment that we're in. My gut feeling is that we're probably going to see a pullback from this push because the politics don't seem to be registering with the average person. And when you think about the average person, I mentioned earlier, 95% of the people that have electric vehicles have other vehicles in the house. Now you take the average person and that's the only vehicle, that's a different story. And it's fine for around town, but if you're taking even a modest trip, it's a different story. And whether it's availability of charging, it's the time of charging, who knows? But the politics of the whole EV world is, I think, going to explode in the next year or so. And ultimately, the average person that does not think about an EV, when they begin to see the economic impact on their lives, is going to vote for somebody other than the party pushing electric vehicles. Yeah.
I just, based on the number of times you use the word politics, I'm getting the impression that the automotive industry has conceded control of their own direction to a government body. And I'm wondering, what's your level of confidence in the current OEM leadership to take back their own business and drive this thing in a direction they really, truly know is correct, rather than listen to all the stuff that's coming out of Washington?
Well, that's a very pertinent question. And when you consider it from the standpoint of a company, you actually have to be able to play whatever game emerges. And when the politicians on the left are really pushing EVs, you've got to talk about EVs. And so I think that's a critical factor. And ultimately, what you have to be able to play is the game that the consumer is playing. And what that's going to be right now is very unpredictable. My guess is that we're going to see a slowdown in this aggressive movement to electric vehicles. And you see so many factors. You know, we're talking about lithium as a key material in batteries. That cost of lithium has gone up about 500%. Where does it come from? Where do the other rare earths come from? What kind of impact are they on the environment? What about you talk about wind and solar? As it turns out, you can't reuse solar blades, and and how long they're going to last. The fact that wind and solar wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. I mean, when you begin to look at the collection of factors that are involved here, it's a really big deal. And the politics are hugely important. And what the companies have basically decided is that you've got to play whatever game, whatever political party is in charge. And so how that's going to flow is uncertain. Very uncertain. But ultimately, I can tell you, talking to leaders in this business, is that whatever game is played, their goal is to be the low-cost producer, because the low-cost producer becomes the profitable producer. The higher-cost producer carries a penalty, as I mentioned with the Ford and the F-Series trucks with aluminum. It's a big deal, huge issue. Yes?
Does much of this argue in favor of hybrids over pure electric? Less a smaller battery, less lithium, and still fossil fuel?
Well, it's certainly been a critical factor. The issue is hybrids versus pure electric. Toyota has done extraordinarily well with their hybrid. And what that means is you can, and I've driven hybrids, you can get 30, 40 miles out of the battery, but then when the battery runs down, you're on an engine again. And how that's going to play out is uncertain. My feeling is that if you're a significant player in this business, you've got to be prepared to play whatever game emerges. If you pick one pathway and that's the only pathway, my feeling is that you're going to pay a significant price for that. Yes?
I just read last night, and your thoughts, I just read that Porsche has developed e-fuel, which they're going to use, which could continue the combustion engine because it's going to produce no carbon.
Right. Well, who knows? I mean, that's one of the ideas behind hydrogen. That is, if you can find a fuel that's not going to release carbon is the enemy. I don't know if you're aware of it, but in terms of carbon reduction, what country has been ahead of the game of everybody in the world? The U.S. Because we've made a transition from coal to CH4. Natural gas is a huge reduction of carbon. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the questions is carbon bad? And I mentioned Frank Jamerson in his discussions. It's not evil. It's not a factor in climate change. So it's going to be an interesting future. As an old guy, I'm in my mid-80s, when you look at the big deal for me, it's relatively short term. My kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids, that's the big deal. Yes?
Europe seems to move more towards hydrogen than electric. Is there a future for hydrogen in North America?
Well, hydrogen is a terrific fuel. The question is, where do you find it? And how do you convert it? For example, water is everywhere. It's H2O. But somehow you have to turn it into a hydrogen. You have to be able to store a significant volume of this, and liquefied hydrogen, for example, to really improve the density of the energy is not simple. And when you look at the total picture, the total spectrum, the total system, what most of the people that are dealing with energy issues are not really thinking about. The hydrogen, if you can produce hydrogen inexpensively and store it effectively, it could be a great thing. No question about it.
Dr. Cole?
Yes.
Hi. Muted for just a second. Got a couple questions from the webinar. One is that apparently is a presentation coming out on February 25th p.m. on event at the automobile. And apparently, it's basically for Black History Month, and C.R. Peterson, an ex-slave, apparently had some impact on the invention of the automobile. Is this anything you know something about?
I really don't. And in fact, while history is important, my focus is on the future.
I've got one more.
I think about back at the time when we, late 1800s, early 1900s, that was a different world than the world we live in today. Phones, cell phones, internet, the simplicity of that world is extremely different than it is today. When you look at it, as a kid, I remember when David made my block with Northwest Detroit at the first television set. And it was a huge box which stood about this. And then at 10 o'clock, what did we see? A test pad. And then you look at the grandkids today with their cell phone, they have no concept of what the technology was when we grew up. And it's really amazing to look at the changes that are occurring. And we'll continue with it. I mean, one of the issues that I think we're all concerned about is what lies ahead in the future. Whether it's technology, the internet, or politics, that's a big deal. The reality is that the future is going to be very interesting. My guess is it's going to be very unpredictable. We have another question?
One more. How do you see PHEVs over the next 5 to 10 years? Because one of our individuals really likes the specific hybrid.
Plug-in hybrid, like,
Yes, sir.
I think we can see it now. Obviously, Toyota has made a tremendous amount of effort in this area, and I think they're not going to quit that. So hybrid is going to continue to be an option. Ultimately, what is going to win is the option that makes the best economics for the average person. That's a critical issue. If economics don't work for the average person, I can tell you, I mentioned this earlier, the average person does not take a guy and get it. It's not in their part of things to do. And when they begin to see either the positive or negative financial impact on their lives of this thing, that will be the defining factor in this industry's future. So, well, anyway, it's been great to be with you all. It's nice to